Welcome to BreakPoint This Week, a weekly conversation about faith and culture from a Christian worldview. Normally, you'd be hearing Shane Morris's voice, his silky smooth, voice that seems older than he actually is. But today he's off, and so I'm just really pleased to welcome Maria Baer to join us in our conversation here on BreakPoint This Week. Maria, great to have you on.
Hi, John. I'm so excited to be here. I am a little intimidated filling in for Shane because I can't quite get that baritone, and there's just a gravitas that accompanies a voice like that. So I'm going to do my best.
Well, the thing you could do is just adopt a British accent, because that also brings a level of authority,
Oh, that's a great
especially more
idea.
authority. So I don't know if you can do that. My daughters can, and I think it has something to do with the fact that they have grown up listening to the Focus on the Family Narnia series on
Right.
CD. So when they were little, they used to play in British accents,
That's
and
great.
yeah, it was pretty great.
That's very cute.
Well, look, let's jump right in. There's plenty of stories to have. By the way, let me just say this. If you aren't familiar with Maria's work, you can find her. She writes frequently for World. She writes frequently for Christianity Today. And she writes frequently for us at the Colson Center. So if you receive our daily Breakpoint commentaries by email, then you'll have seen her picture and seen her name along with mine. She's helped me co-author, I think, some terrific commentaries over the last several months since she's been a part of the Colson Center family. Maria, obviously the story of the week that continues to be the story of the week. It's now the story of the second half of 2020, which is saying a lot given how many stories there have been in 2020, is that the election in a sense continues, but really seems to be winding down. There's a real debate over whether to use the term president-elect. It's certainly not official, although it's certainly not unheard of that that name would be used once an election is decided. President Trump claims that the election is not decided and that it's actually, in fact, was stolen, that there's widespread evidence of fraud. News outlets are reporting that there's not widespread evidence of fraud and that there's no more fraud than typically happens in an election cycle. But the conversation, in a sense, continues.
Yeah, it's difficult because it's unsettling to this is sort of a non-peaceful transition of power, which I wouldn't say we're having a non-peaceful situation right now. We don't have violence happening right now, obviously, which I'm grateful for. But this sort of like it's up in the air what's happening in international politics is not something at least I am used to in our nation. So it's unsettling for sure. It's unsettling too because President Trump was making comments even before the election that if he didn't win, that it would call into question whether it was valid. And I think that speaks to a larger issue, which is a loss of faith and trust in our institutions. And whether that's warranted or not, I think you could go by certain issues that have happened in states over the years and say that it might be warranted. But on this level, and as you noted, they're not offering, the Trump campaign is not offering a wide breadth of evidence as to fraud. It's just unsettling to think that a lot of people in the country and powerful people, in his case, may have lost that trust in the process.
Yeah, and one of the things we've been saying since the COVID pandemic happened is that the pre-existing conditions are what's really the story here, not the things that the
Mm-hmm.
pandemic caused, but the thing that the pandemic has revealed. I think that same thing is true here with the election cycle. We have a nation in which one side spent the last 4 years questioning the legitimacy of the election
Mm-hmm.
results in 2016, questioning the legitimacy of this presidency. And it's really hard. It really is hard. It's a lot to ask of people to pivot so quickly from resist to unite, as if there was no ground in between. And that's really kind of where we're finding ourselves. For the president's part, as you said, he cast doubt on this before the election, much less before these results. And there are some really strange stories. There are
Mm-hmm.
reports coming in. There are workers in polls that are signing affidavits saying that they saw things that were sketchy. We've got questions about voting machines and all that. And the hardest thing about it is it's just absolutely impossible from a consumer standpoint of news to know what is valid and what is not. I mean, literally, it's impossible. Now, I know I'm going to get emails from a whole lot of people that are completely certain about this. And, one only needs to go through Twitter to be certain who's the president and who's not and why and so on and so on.
Right.
But the fact of the matter is it's impossible to know. because as soon as a piece of evidence is put out there, in very similar ways as the Hunter Biden story right before the election, the immediate gut reaction of most media outlets is to say it's not legitimate.
Right.
And how do you know? I mean, we haven't even taken a look at it yet. And some of these stories are certainly really interesting. And what do you do with these signed affidavits and, and so on. On the flip side, it's one thing for President Trump to pursue all of his legal options, which he can do and he should do.
And he should,
It's, yeah, that's right. And to let the courts then actually decide. It's a completely different sort of situation. To pursue those legal options while pronouncing the verdict, that the election was actually, stolen. I think we're going to see a whole lot of things corrected in the final tallies. It doesn't look right now that there's anything widespread enough to change the results that seem to be inevitable at this point. Even Robert Jeffers, one of the president's advisors, seemed to admit this week that that's where this is going.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think I read through some of the specific allegations today out of Michigan, and a lot of it seemed to be more of an intuition sort of thing than, I saw somebody illegally fill out a ballot, but it was like, this person wouldn't quite let me see what they were doing, or they dropped some ballots and they didn't pick them all up right away. And the sort of thing where, when you have this many human beings involved in such a large task of counting all of these ballots, everything, there is going to be confusion. And unfortunately, when we've already sowed, and for good reason on both sides, I think we've already sowed a little bit of a mistrust in the process, then things that might be innocuous can look kind of suspicious. And then, which is again why, like you said, I think he should pursue his legal options, because given all this confusion, it would be good to let the process run its course and make sure that there's nothing widespread. But I do, I agree. It's unwise to sort of make a prediction or make a proclamation before that happens.
I mean, that context point is so important, and not just because we've had, again, 4 years of questioning the results of the last election, and now all of a sudden we're supposed to trust it. And those who say trusted in 16 now say we're supposed to question it. But it's even more than that. And we've talked a little bit about this within our editorial meetings and as well as on BreakPoint. And Shane and I talked about this, I think, even as recently as last week. Chuck Colson often said that politics is downstream from culture, and that is mostly the way that it is. But there are moments within a cultural context in which certain aspects of culture escalate and they become more important than others. And the fact of the matter is, politics isn't downstream from culture in as many ways as it used to be. Right now, politics is culture. Politics is dominating the cultural discourse. Political figures are dominating the cultural scene. And the narratives and so on and so on and so on. And so what that means, in my mind, is that suddenly everything becomes a matter of life and death, right? The escalation of issues and the significance of it. And when so much is on the line, I would think we should expect that there would be more tampering and more, sketchy activity, because more people think that literally the world is going to come to an end unless this election turns out the way they want to. And the reason they think that is because there have been pundits for 4 years saying the world is going to come to an end, right? I mean, in other words, we're kind of just doing what people tell us to do in this respect. And of course, the tension, and of course, it's going to feel like everything is at stake. And this is one of the things that I think is the best test. We've had a bunch of tests over the last 4 years of the church and the church's ability to resist and avoid the political illusion. I'm not sure we've had a test kind of this acute and this important. Look, is the kingdom over? Is the world over? Are we able to still think clearly if this election doesn't end up the way that it does, or if it does end up the way that we think it will?
Right. I think it's one of those things where when you've lived in relative comfort for so long, or when you have a generation such as mine who never lived through a war, right? And now we're coming of age and we're adults in the working world.
So wait, hold on. What are you? Are you a millennial officially?
I'm a millennial.
You are a millennial. Wow, I've heard of you guys. Yeah, there you are.
I'm supposed to wear a badge, I think.
You are supposed to wear a badge just to let everyone know to stay 6 feet away.
Red A on my shirt, red M. to stay 6 feet away. That's good. But I think when you've lived in relative comfort, things that aren't as important start to feel like they are. So like you're told, like if you've been told for the past 4 years that if Donald Trump is president again, you're at the risk of dying. And that's not an overstatement. People will say something like that.
Listen, we've had headlines in the last 3 days that if Donald Trump is still president for the rest of his term, you're at risk. I mean, in other words.
And if you believed that and you didn't tamper with the election, frankly, I'm kind of questioning your motives at that point. Like if you actually thought, and that's the thing, I don't think most people don't actually believe things like
but
that.
Some do.
But some do. And that's the climate we're in. I just saw a tweet yesterday from a columnist at the New York Times, Kevin Roos. He said, this is the tweet: "It is possible for a story to be factually accurate and for it to be part of a misinformation campaign." And understandably, there was a lot of pushback to that tweet. So he's basically saying, like you were suggesting before, if the outcome of something isn't what we had wanted, then you can classify the thing as misinformation or false or wrong. And that's a big problem on both sides. That's the climate that has led to this election not being, confirmed or done yet.
We need to go to a break, but I just want to bring 2 punchlines out of what we just said, because it's such an important thing. I mean, number one is that politics has taken over more and more and more and more and more of our daily lives. And that means that we are going to suffer dramatically from the political illusion unless we're intentional, really not to. I think it also is not the way. There's no political way to rebuild community trust. Let me say it again. There's not a political means to regain the sort of trust that is required for a society to have a future. We, as I said this week on BreakPoint, we're not just debating the best way to get to our common shared vision of the good life. We're debating what the good life even is. And we have radically different views, not even a little bit different views, but radically different views across the spectrum. And with that much at stake, politics has taken over more in our lives. There's not a political way to get to where we need to get to. That's the opportunity and the crisis, I think, for God's people. You're listening to BreakPoint This Week. I'm John Stonestreet here along with Maria Baer. We'll be right back. We're back on BreakPoint This Week. John Stonestreet here along with Maria Baer. You can come to breakpoint.org and we'll link to the various articles and resources that we mentioned on today's program, as well as a whole week of BreakPoint commentaries that we're talking about, at least in part here in our conversation. Maria, let's put this into the elections have consequences story. I'm a little bit hesitant, and you have been among the voices on our team most loudly saying, politics, we need to get beyond politics. We need to get beyond politics. But before we do, not just yet, there was a pretty dramatic debate in the Christian community right before the election. Some of it was sparked because of a video from the original creator of VeggieTales, Phil Vischer, and also his podcast partner. They have a really cool name for their podcast too. What's the name? Can you remember?
I can't remember.
Oh, we have to think that up. It's really cool. And anyway, Sky Jathani is his his partner there on the podcast. And so anyway.
Pastors in Power? Is that what it is?
No, that's way too bland. No, it's way cooler than that.
Okay.
Yeah, I can't remember what it is. But anyway, we'll think of it here before too long.
Okay.
But they put out an article, or I guess a video, and it wasn't unlike some articles and other things that we read, basically saying, look, if you're a one-issue voter, if abortion is what you care about, then you don't need to be tied when it comes to this election, because presidential elections don't make that big of a difference when it comes to abortion. And sometimes that is accompanied by some numbers. Sometimes that's just accompanied by the claim that, hey, we've had a Republican president with a Republican majority in the House and Senate, and we still have Roe v. Wade, and it didn't go anywhere. Now I start by saying that so that we can, again, look at the agenda items in the first 100 days of President. What do we call him? It's not okay to call him president-elect yet for so many people. This guy, Joe Biden, who might be president.
President maybe.
President maybe Joe Biden.
Maybe President Joe Biden.
You coined that. You could tweet that. That would actually go over well. Basically immediately is going to change some of the policies foreign policies in particular and the role that abortion plays. Most of the conversations about whether or not a president makes a difference in abortion had to do with domestic policy issues, Roe v. Wade, and so on. We're immediately seeing that it makes a difference in foreign policy.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So the news that's come out now is that he's going to rescind what's known as the Mexico City policy. It's also called the global gag rule. And this sort of has been going back and forth for decades, that Republican presidents typically will reinforce it and Democratic presidents will get rid of it during their tenure. And essentially what this is that when it's in place, as it has been under President Trump, it stipulates that the United States will not give federal funding to foreign international aid that recommends women for abortion. This is one of those things, like you said, with elections having consequences, that the government and policies like this does have the capacity to shape our imaginations. When you go, I've heard Obianuju Ekiocha speak several times, and she's done a lot of really cool work with the Colson Center. She is Nigerian. She's also a biomedical, I believe she has a degree in biomedicine, but I think she currently lives in the UK. I might be wrong about that, but she has talked about communities in Africa specifically where abortion has never been part of the cultural consciousness. So she cites statistics, I think I was reading today, that before some of these organizations, including the international arm of Planned Parenthood, came into some of these countries, such as Uganda and Kenya and Nigeria, the support for abortion was less than like 20%. I mean, there might not have even been a knowledge in some of these communities that was an option for women. Once you enter into the cultural consciousness that this is an avenue that not only is it open to you, but it's preferable for you, that does have the power to shape minds and families. And it's interesting because a lot of times I think a lot of left-leaning folks are the ones pushing a lot of these policies. For example, we now have a Democratic maybe president who's going to rescind the global gag rule. These are typically the same folks who will openly criticize what they consider to be imperialism or pushing, American ideals on other nations. That's exactly what this is.
Right. It's an ideological imperialism. And it's based on a progressive vision that, the more sexually permissive a society is, the more free it is for women, the more healthy it is, the more, progressive that it is. So I think people would respond and say, look, the Mexico City policy has been a football, it goes from one administration to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. And that is actually true. And Trump rescinded it. And now we have it. We will have it back under a Biden administration, if maybe. At the same time, though, I think it's worth saying this imagination point you're bringing up, I think, is bigger than people give it credit for. A few weeks ago, we heard from a U.S. ambassador. She's the ambassador for women's issues. She's the ambassador to the UN and internationally. So this is the world she's living in. She's living in this policy world. And even when the Mexico City policy was rescinded under previous conservative administrations, you still have personnel on the ground there with the wink, wink, nod, nod, tying aid and other things to reproductive services. In other words, there's a million nomenclature ways to get around the letter of the Mexico City policy. The anti-Mexico City policy, law. There's a million ways to get around it. This ambassador reaches out to us, and she asked to be on one of our newest podcasts, the Strong Women podcast, which was super cool, because my wife, I'm a big fan of, and her and Aaron Kunkel are doing just a tremendous job, just kind of highlighting the strength of women in various contexts. And so they had a great conversation, and my wife asked her the question, look, this position has been used basically as the loggerhead to advance abortion rights around the world in the name of women's freedoms and reproductive health and so on and so on and so on. Where do you stand on this? And And her articulation of this was not just a, hey, here's our official policy. And it wasn't just, here's my personal views. It was, oh no, this office under this administration absolutely does not do that. We understand that women's causes, women don't need to fight against their, reproductive natures in order to advance their rights. This has to do with, inheritance and communication and voting and driving and the things that we can do to uplift the status of women around the world. And this will not happen under, and that's actually, there has been, like it or not, a good bit more substance to the rhetoric under this administration when it comes to life issues. We can certainly see that in the courts. Now, look, we've been disappointed in the courts before, but there also wasn't a farm team of legal minds to put into these positions until now. And thanks for the Blackstone Fellowship and the Federalist Society and some of the other organizations that have been really working to provide legal minds that can move into these important areas of influence. So I remain just thoroughly unconvinced. Not to mention, so I just remain thoroughly unconvinced about this idea that who is president doesn't affect abortion. It does affect abortion. Certainly affects it around the world. By the way, I think the argument that it doesn't affect it here is absolutely not true either.
Yeah, what's strange is I think a lot of time that argument hinges on a really reductionist view of what people are capable of. So I just read another article of a woman saying, what if, all these pro-lifers who spend all their time and energy marching, what if instead they volunteered at a crisis pregnancy center? As if there's no such person who does both of those things. It was such a strange thing.
Well, and as if there's no such centers. I mean, listen, right. I speak at 30 of these a year. I go to towns I've never heard of before. It's, in other words, right. These things are everywhere. This is, other than the church itself, I don't know that there is a more decentralized, widespread movement, at least in the United States, than the Pregnancy Resource Center
crisis
movement.
Pregnancy. I totally agree. And the other thing is, their ability to do what they're doing depends sometimes on what the people at those marches are fighting for or asking for. We saw that in California with the when California tried to restrict that, they said all crisis pregnancy centers must advertise for local abortion clinics. And they thankfully fought that. But you can't pretend, I think sometimes we define politics when we're saying, well, politics is one thing, but we really need to do this work on the ground for women.
Right.
I think maybe we're defining politics in a wrong way. We're thinking of it as like people doing their back and forth on Fox News at night, that's politics. The stuff that we're doing day to day, interacting with people and women and all that, that's not politics. But the thing is that everything is politics. When you think about the influence that the government can have over what, like I said, what crisis pregnancy centers can and can't do. But again, I think this view that there's either people who are on the political side fighting, and they're fighting the abortion giants and whatever, or there's people actually helping women. I think just from my own experience, I spent years volunteering at a crisis pregnancy center. They're the same people. So, right. So they're doing political activism, but they're also working at the centers.
Yeah. I mean, just go to the March for Life and it's right. Really a remarkable thing. And I do think we should mention, since we brought up, the video that was done by Phil Vischer and Skye Jethani, that they did not say that all politics was irrelevant to the pro-life movement and the number of abortions. They were specifically talking about the presidential office. In fact, I think Skye actually talked about the importance of down ballot, races. And we have too, right? I mean, there's no question who's governor in your state, elect. They're the ones that appoint a civil rights commission. And the civil rights commission decides whether, Jack Phillips can make a decision about a wedding cake or not, right? And whether a pregnancy resource center can exist, even if it doesn't put up a big old advertisement with, what was it, 26-point font or something like that in California?
It was crazy.
Yeah, it was draconian.
It was like saying every McDonald's has to put up a sign that says, "Hey, have you considered Wendy's before you come in here?"
That's
Just
exactly
think about
right.
that for a second.
Now, if any of our folks from California that are listening, I will just say it was kind of like Governor Newsom's Thanksgiving order. It was kind of in that same realm of ridiculous. And everyone from California immediately nods their heads and says, "Oh yeah, that's what it is." Sure. You're listening to BreakPoint This Week. I'm John Stonestreet here along with Maria Baer. We're talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview. Come to breakpoint.org. breakpoint.org, and we'll link to all of the stories and resources and different pieces of information that we have talked about on today's program. Going to take another quick break. We'll be right back. We're back on BreakPoint this week. John Stonestreet here, along with Maria Baer, sitting in for the late, great Shane Moore. I shouldn't say late, great. That sounds really more. He's not late at all. He's younger than all of us. The great Shane Morris on BreakPoint this week. Thanks so much for joining us. And by the way, if you catch us on terrestrial radio stations, we welcome you. And also want to let you know that you can also make sure that you don't miss a single episode of our BreakPoint commentaries or BreakPoint This Week by going to the BreakPoint podcast. We also have some additional material there, and that I think you'll find beneficial. All right, so Maria, I want to jump into here for our final story that we're going to talk about today, the church and the pandemic. In a sense, I guess we expected this to be a conversation that's looking back at how did the church handle the pandemic? How did it survive during the pandemic? Look, I'm in Colorado. Colorado just retightened its stay-at-home restrictions and this week. And we also are seeing the same thing in many states. We have new rates of infection that are spiking, and we have now the church. Now, we did see, I think, state forces using their power to step on churches' freedom. For example, in Colorado, that has been handled completely differently with these retightening. So even as the capacity for restaurants and so on go from 50 to 25%, churches aren't affected because of religious liberty rules. And that's a good thing. But look, it's a really interesting time, because what we saw before the pandemic, I think by and large, according to most studies, is that megachurches in particular were growing, especially multi-site churches. They weren't going anywhere. Our friend Warren Smith over at Ministry Watch reported on this just recently. And then we had every church shutting down. And what does that look like? What does that mean? And churches saying, look, we're online and we're reaching more people than ever. We're a 300-member church, and we had 5,000 views on this video. And wow, isn't that great? And now, as churches are reopening, even after some of those, high view numbers have gone down, which many churches have reported, not all, but many churches, I'm hearing more and more from pastors who are having a hard time getting anywhere close to the numbers that they were prior to the pandemic. Right. And even if they are under limited capacity in terms of square footage or 50%, and even if they're offering hybrid options of live and in person and online, they're just not getting there.
Yeah, and it's hard to know too whether that. It's probably a little bit of all of everything, but it's hard to know whether that's people still nervous maybe to meet, to go back, or people who've decided during the pandemic that, hey, I really liked watching it online. And I'm going to stick with that, or who just, unfortunately decided that it was a superfluous part of their life that they're not going to continue to pursue. It's hard to know exactly what's driving that. But like you said, I think this also we're probably going to see that megachurches will continue to grow, not necessarily because church attendance is going to grow everywhere, but because the churches that were bigger or had more resources before the pandemic are going to be the ones that are more likely to survive the pandemic. And so I don't think that trend is going to be going anywhere, including the multi-site trend as well. I think it's possible we'll see even more of that after the pandemic, because smaller churches will have a harder time surviving, and we'll be looking possibly to larger churches to join those churches, or to create a network together so that they can coexist. So it'll be really interesting to watch that proceed in the following months and years, for sure.
Yeah, and to your point that it wasn't one thing, it was many things. I mean, at the same time, in the middle of all this, and people were trying to figure out, how to still worship during this time, you had some cultural upheaval having to do both with the election, certainly with the race issue and Black Lives Matter, and the choice of churches and how to handle that situation and who to identify with, and so on. And you put all of this together, and it becomes a really difficult thing. But there is one thing that I want to point out, and again, this is a postulation before evidence, and I wonder if the evidence is going to bear it out. But by and large, the evangelical church in America has been an attraction model. It's been look, we will, bring you here. We'll give you a wonderful experience. There's not really, though, a sense of ownership. That's why in so many cases, when a church explodes in a particular community, it's not because they're winning converts. It's because they're, as some people would say, uh, stealing sheep, in other words, from other churches, and it becomes a marketing game. And look, if you win by that, you die by that. When it becomes when people, for example, realize that they have, some really cool music on their MP3 players, or, that they can stream on their home speakers with cool worship music, with a good sound system, and then they can get the best preacher they can find on a podcast. And really, there wasn't much more to church than going and receiving anyway. There wasn't kind of a participation. Then look, it's a whole lot easier to do it that way than to try to get your two kids out of bed and get them dressed and, feed them breakfast and still make it. And it's the whole idea. What you win them to, you win, what you win them by, you win them to. And this is something I think that might play itself out as a result of this pandemic. And at the same time, we're going to have to ask these hard questions, like, what is the church? What is the role of the church? What does it mean for someone to be a part of a church? All these questions are new again.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm doing a study right now with some of my friends from church, socially distanced, of course, but we're looking at the Sermon on the Mount. And I feel like one of the things Jesus does at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount is he's setting an expectation. Like, so you guys think you're joining my crew and that we're going to have like a great political victory. We're going to overthrow the Romans and it's going to be awesome. I just want to set the expectations. This is going to be really difficult. I'm looking for poor in spirit. I'm looking for meek. I'm looking for mourning because you're mourning the sinful state of the world, that kind of thing. And I just thought of that just now when you're saying what we win them to, because I think if we sell church as a place to come and enjoy yourself all the time and feel better and feel uplifted, which certainly that's a part of walking with Jesus. But if we sell it as that's all it is, we are not setting the right expectation. And once, persecution comes, or once even just personal difficulty comes, then it's not nearly as attractive as we thought it was. And that's, I think when it becomes easy to leave it. So I think I'm glad I'm not a pastor, because that is a difficult responsibility to try to show people the joy of the Lord and attracting them to church, but also set a right expectation that, listen, this isn't a country club. Like, this isn't a place to come enjoy yourself every week. And that's hard.
Yeah. We said this before. I mean, in this whole context is, it's easy to point fingers at pastors. But look, pastors are hired to make disciples, but they're fired and measured upon whether, they fill the church. So you're hired for one thing and you're measured completely on a different set of conditions. That's a pretty dramatic difference, there that has to be navigated. And it's tempting now to say, look, you should pick up the book, Live Not by Lies by Rod Dreher, because he's talking a little bit about this. And I had a conversation with him recently on the BreakPoint podcast. So come to breakpoint.org. We'll link to that episode of the BreakPoint podcast. You can also find it anywhere you get your podcast, Spotify, Apple Music. What are the other ones? All the other ones.
I don't know.
Yeah.
SoundCloud.
Sure. That sounds great.
That sounds like something, right?
That sounds important. I think it's on YouTube as well. So anyway, we're trying to get it out as many ways as possible. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Maria, great to have you sit in here for Shane. You did a terrific job, and appreciate having you on the team.
Yes, thanks for having me. I hope I sounded trustworthy, even in my alto, soprano, non-baritone voice.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. And again, you can find more resources at breakpoint.org. Going to take another quick break. We'll be right back. Well, before we close out our conversation today, Maria, we're going to invite you into a little tradition that Shane and I have, which is making a recommendation. And it's been pretty diverse so far. Shane always is, really kind of serious and recommend something like a book or whatever. And I've recommended, films and movies and television shows and that sort of stuff. And I'm tempted to make a homeschool joke here, but I'm not going to. I am not going to do that. But what we try to do with the recommendation section here is just, hey, something that has been really important and something that has meant a lot to you that can bring joy or depth or something like that to somebody else. So Maria, what you got?
I'm so excited about this. This is like my first foray into being like a lifestyle blogger. I get to tell you a cool new product that I had. No, I'm kidding. Okay. So I do have something I would love to recommend though. So I'm a little biased because this is, it's a podcast by a friend of mine. He was a worship pastor at my church in Arizona back when we lived in Phoenix. And he is a brilliant writer, just super creative guy. And he launched a podcast, I think last year, but it's called Light Catchers. So I think it's the Light Catchers podcast, and it's actually stories for kids. So each episode, I think, is usually like 12 to 15 minutes long, but it's him telling a story that he's written. And the stories are really cute and sweet, but also have like great lessons in them and great morals. And I have a 4.5-year-old who quite literally doesn't stop talking from the moment she wakes up until she goes to sleep. But when I put on this podcast, she stops and listens, which is a gift for all of us. So it's called the Light Catchers
gift
Podcast.
That keeps on giving. The Light Catchers Podcast.
Light Catchers Podcast. CC Kimmel is his name, and it's awesome. It's
all right.
So fun.
Well, I mean, gosh, where was this? I had a girl that never stopped talking when she was really somewhere between, well, verbal at all until she still kind of never stops talking, actually.
I think my dad would probably say the same about me, that I still have not stopped.
Yeah, that might be the case. Good recommendation. I am going to recommend something that I post every year. We have it hanging on our wall, and this is, I think, our first recommendation of actually a painting. But I'm going to recommend it because it's that time of year, and I think it's an important one. And it's a painting from a nun in a monastery or a nunnery, I guess you would say, that I think they make chocolate, and they do a whole lot of holiday stuff. Ooh. And they do a whole lot of really cool stuff like that. But there was a painting out of this.
Where is this
nunnery? I know I should have looked it up, but I'm just going to tell you the painting because you can just Google it, and it is just remarkable. It's called Mary Consoles Eve. Mary Consoles Eve. And it is a wonderful piece of modern sacred art, and that has essentially a woman clearly showing pregnancy, reaching out and comforting a dejected woman with a snake around her foot. And it's just really cleverly done, and it's really special. I always post it around Advent time. Of course, this is, given at least our memory of our cultural traditional memory of when Jesus was, born and so on. We're getting close, right? I mean, we're past the Annunciation. We're talking about, anticipation here. And we'll get into in coming weeks talking about Advent traditions and Advent habits, because Christmas happens to too many of us. And you know what? We've just got a little bit more elbow room this year to make sure we don't miss Christmas by not missing the preparation time of Advent. And this image in and of itself, something to look at. You can cheaply purchase a print. I think they make Christmas cards out of them and so on. And it's a remarkable thing that means a lot to me and to our family at this time of year. So Mary Consoles Eve by some nuns somewhere that make chocolate. And if you come to breakpoint.org, we'll add the link to where you can actually find it.
I think I missed my calling, a nun who makes chocolate. I don't know. That sounds pretty good.
Yeah, we all chose different paths, didn't we? Well, Maria, great to have you on BreakPoint this week. Thanks for sitting in for Shane. Shane will be back with us next week, and we'll have you back on at some point. It'll be great, and really appreciate having you a part of the team. You can find Maria, where can people find your work?
Oh, so I have a website. It's Maria E. Baer, Baer, mariaebaer.com.
mariaebaer.com. You can also find her stuff at breakpoint.org, also at Christianity Today and World Magazine. For Maria, I'm John Stonestreet. Thanks so much for joining us.